Welcome to this week's deep dive for Not Knowing Jesus. We're in week 34.
This is it.
This is it.
We finished. Crossed the line. We know him. No.
We know him better, hopefully.
Yeah, know him better.
We will continue to do the deep dive for our next series. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But yeah, we're going to be looking this week. Last week we talked about Melchizedek and the Trinity. Okay. So we figured this week, we'll talk about the end times. And,
go big or go home.
Yes. Joined by lead pastor, Pastor Terry, and Pastor Mike, one of our executive pastors. And so I'm just excited to talk about Revelation, talk about the end times, talk about the passage a little bit, the Matthew 24. Yeah. But before we get there, I just want to ask you guys, what has this series done for you? How have you, what have you learned? What have you felt? How has your understanding of who Jesus is changed or been shaped?
Yeah, I mean, there have been times, in my career, I preached through Mark, I preached through a different gospel, I preached through different things. But this is the first time I really sat down to try to do a chronology. And of course, we missed a whole ton of things. I mean,
yeah, we didn't hit everything. Yeah,
we didn't hit everything. But it's really helpful to see Jesus, helpful to see how he's responding in difficult situations or certain situations. As we'll look today, it puts certain stories and parables in a completely different context when you look at that. So I think for me, that's what's been exciting, is seeing Jesus, seeing the way the crowds have responded, how people respond, and just learning more about him and knowing him more. And as we talked last week, the same Jesus, the Gospels is the same Jesus at work today.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of see week to week the characters or the things that stick out that, like, the crowd obviously is something in the Gospels that, like, it's almost a character of itself,
right.
But you kind of see as we've gone through the life of Christ the different functions that the crowd serves in his ministry. Mike, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think very similar. I do think that the context of all of the ministry in Jesus is so important to understand each individual thing. Where are we in the arc of Jesus' ministry? Does the crowd like him? Is the crowd big? Is the crowd turning against him? That sort of dynamic that you get when you sort of walk through it chronologically really helps you understand each individual story and what Jesus is saying. And why he doesn't say this thing yet, because he's going to say it later, and he knows, that might accelerate the chronology, and so he's doing everything in its time. So I just think you get a better understanding walking through it in that sense, because you get everything in kind of proportion and context.
Yeah, that's really good. I think for me too, that's the thing, is we haven't hit everything. Terry, as you mentioned, we didn't hit every parable,
right.
We didn't hit every miracle, but I think even moving forward as we get out of this series, when we do have other teaching series, in the future where we're talking about some of the teachings of Christ, we're going to be able to situate them a little bit into this story of his life, much like a few years ago when we did the whole story, right? We went from Genesis to Revelation. We now are able to situate, different things, gives us a little bit of context to help better understand those other stories.
Yeah. I mean, I think even we've seen that since the whole story, which probably, arguably, we could do that again.
Yes.
But to see where things fit, and it's like, oh, you understand the whole arc of Scripture. Now you understand the arc of Jesus' life.
Yeah.
Okay?
Cool.
It's been great. It's been good. But I'm excited about the next series. So
yeah, it's always nice to get into the next thing. Before we do that, today we're going to talk about Revelation. We're going to talk about the end times. There's kind of a fascination, I think, in our culture. You look at all movies and books that come out. The focus on the apocalypse, on the end of the world, on this different kind of almost dystopian realities. Like, I want to ask you guys that question before we get into kind of the meat of this: is what makes the end of the world? What makes that such a fascinating subject or topic?
I think there's a number of reasons. I do think in our time now, we're in sort of a unique time where our culture has sort of given up on the writ large, the big Christian story. And so without that sort of explanation of things, there's just more anxiety about the future in general. And as our artistic culture looks into the future, it's not the Jetsons, it's not utopia anymore. It's pretty much all dystopia.
Yeah.
It's zombies and, famine and the end of the world. And that says something about the moment that we're in and how people view now.
Yeah.
So I do think that plays into that sort of what does the Bible have to say about the end of this age. And then, of course, we're old enough to remember the 70s and Hal Lindsey and Late Great Planet Earth. And it's sort of been a building cultural thing for a long time, really, in the church.
Yeah. I mean, in Ecclesiastes, God's put eternity in our heart, right? There is something about the future. I think is one thing that separates humans from the rest of the animal kingdom is we're thinking about the future and what happens. There's some future oriented. So we're naturally inclined to do that. And then I think, since the Great World War I, the war to end all wars, then the bomb and the world could be destroyed in minutes, and then a pandemic now, people's mortality is much more in their frontal thinking. So
Yeah.
I think there's always something about what could we do and what happens. And the media, books, movies, they talk about that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think to just situate that within the Christian story, it's part of the Christian story, and it's kind of a confusing part of the story. I mean, even as we're going to see in the passage today, the disciples were asking Jesus about the end of the age. Paul and writings, he's responding to questions about how to live in as we wait for Christ's return. And then when you look at Revelation, apocalyptic as like a genre, it doesn't there's a whole lot of questions. It gives us a lot more questions than it does answers, but it does give us the one answer, which is what we're gonna hit on. I appreciate too this weekend, in the message. I mean, we're gonna talk about some stuff during this that we didn't hit on in the weekend.
Right.
But the one answer, the one question we do need to be confident in is that Jesus is going to return.
Yes.
How he returns, when he returns, all of those, the order of that things are going to happen. They're important questions. They're important conversations for us to have. But at the same time, the focus should be, hey, Christ is coming back. So in the meantime, let's live like he's coming back.
Yeah.
So before we really dive in, I want to just kind of maybe define a few terms. We want to kind of talk about different ways that different groups of Christians historically have thought about Revelation, have thought about the end of the world and end times and the order of all of that. But I do think it'd be helpful to just kind of define a few terms. So the first one I want to hit is rapture. I've heard this word before. What is the rapture? Is there a rapture? What do we mean by that? So I guess Mike, the rapture. What do we?
The rapture is when the church is taken out of the world. And whether or if or when, there's also wide disagreement about it in the church. And disagreement not just in the sense that people disagree about things, but, real Bible-believing Orthodox Christians have different views on when or if some of these things will happen and how they will lay out. So that's important to put out there, that this isn't the truth of the gospel or not. This is some of the the chronology that's in our future that we're not all in agreement on, and that's kind of okay.
That's kind of okay.
It's kind of okay.
It's kind of the blessing of our denomination, the EFCA, major on the major, minor on the minors. We want to be clear on things that have to do with salvation. We want to be clear with things that have to do with the gospel. But other than that, they're still important. But
we can have beliefs, but we won't separate over disagreement. So the rapture is when traditionally the rapture is before this great tribulation, or perhaps in the middle of this great tribulation, or some would say at the end of this great tribulation. The church is taken away so that the world can be judged with God's wrath is then poured out on the world. That the church is not a part of that.
The rapture kind of comes, I think, culturally comes to mind. The left behind, the guys just in their, you find their clothes just sitting there.
Right. That is the more popular view, I guess, culturally, because a lot of the churches had that view in America for a long time, that the rapture is the sort of the next thing that happens is the church is gone. Pile of clothes.
Could have had an opportunity.
We don't know about the pile of clothes.
Well, we could have had an opportunity there to do a quick edit and just leave clothes.
Here. So that's and in fact, I think I hear stories of people who grew up in the church, who were kids in the church, who would come home and maybe the house would be empty. And their first thought was, I missed the rapture.
I missed it.
Yeah.
Which
Where's mom and dad? They went without me.
Which I wasn't a Christian when I was 7, 8, or 9 when that happened. So I don't really have that experience, but I do think that's part of the cultural background of American church.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, what about the word tribulation? Mike just
Well,
referenced
yeah.
it 3 times. So what?
The tribulation speaks of a time of great trouble, sorrow, difficulty. I mean, it's some of what we looked at in an increasing degree that Matthew talks about: earthquakes, pestilence, whatever that is, probably wars with people. So looking at Daniel and other verses, there's a sense that it's a 7-year period, in particular, of great difficulty and tribulation. Often that some worldwide ruler would arise who would try to make sense and try to help people through this difficult time, but that who would be called the Antichrist would actually lead people away from God and more worship of themselves. And that's why some believe that the church being raptured, taken up out of the world, would launch a 7-year tribulation, because what's going to happen without the Holy Spirit in people and without the church?
So you just bring up another word, Antichrist.
Yes.
We hear it's almost like you get into an argument on social media. At some point, someone is going to call someone a Nazi or Hitler, right? And I think in Christian speak, we're trying to identify who the Antichrist is. So what is the Antichrist? I had a video game at one point, and it was like, I think it was a Left Behind version, and the tagline on the end was, "The Antichrist is coming. Don't get left behind." But anyway, so the Antichrist, what is it? Who is it? Not specifically who is it, but
yeah, if we knew, wouldn't that be live revealed?
Yes,
today?
right here
We'd
on the
go
deep
absolutely
dive.
viral. So I mean, we don't know. There's some people who believe the Antichrist is alive now. Some don't. Who's that leader? Who's going to rise up? But again, probably a sense of worldwide panic, pandemonium, that this leader kind of helps bring it all together and restore that. And there's sense that that they're going to bring peace, but ultimately they'll bring rejection of God, and that it'll end kind of badly. That the only way is that Christ has to come and put an end to that.
And I think too, as Christ was the presence of God in the world, the Antichrist is sort of, whether inhabited by Satan, or he's the presence of Satan in the world.
Yeah.
And so it's a big sort of a time of testing and choosing.
Yeah.
So I do think, many are led astray as Satan comes from one final test before the end of all things.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last word, and this is going to kind of get us into kind of some of the meat of this, but the millennial reign, the millennium, we see that pop up in Revelation.
Right. So the millennium is a 1,000-year period, what means of the reign of Christ. So there are different millennial viewpoints. Again, premillennial is the one historically the Free Church believed. Now they're more open, that there's several different views, but that kind of what we've talked about, that the rapture, the taking up of the church, would create 7 years of tribulation. That Jesus would then come and reign physically on the earth, that the earth would stay as it is for 1,000 years. At the end of that 1,000 years, Satan would almost be loosed. There would be a final vanquishing of Satan, a final battle. He will be thrown into the lake of fire forever. And then this earth will become a new heaven and new earth. God will bring heaven down here and do that. But it's a physical reign of Jesus on the earth. After that period of tribulation, so that's still to come. That there's an actual physical period of Christ sitting on the throne, reigning in Jerusalem,
and lots of different flavors of that. Lots of different, kind of reordering of certain events within that. I do think that it is important to note that within the different schools of thought, on even terms of understanding, a lot of it is just the order of which all of these things.
Right, trying to make sense of all the scripture pointing together. There's not really.
Not a timeline.
There's no timeline.
I mean, even the book of Revelation, right? It's so figurative. It's apocalyptic literature. We don't really have a whole lot of examples on how to even utilize that. It kind of is connected to prophecy, but it's also something that seemed to be pretty specific in the Jewish world and the Jewish writings as well. Okay, so that's premillennialism. What about amillennialism?
Amillennialism is the notion that in Acts, when Christ ascends to heaven, he ascends to the throne and begins to reign. And so the millennium is happening now.
Yeah.
1,000 years then would be figurative or
Figurative.
metaphorical, meaning a very long time. And so he's reigning and ruling. That's the reign. And then, therefore, when he comes, there isn't that intervening 1,000 years on earth. It all sort of happens at the same time. There's the battle, the judgment, Satan's throne, new heaven and new earth, all happens in one fell swoop. And so that's a view that, again, many outstanding Christians hold that view.
For sure, yeah.
I think I'm probably more premillennial, although I'm not 1,000% sure, and I don't necessarily feel like I have to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I do think, as you said, there isn't a timeline. It's figurative language. I think that's for a reason. I don't think that's a flaw. I think that's by design.
Yeah.
To get us to focus on what Jesus says in this passage.
Yeah.
Right? Would be ready.
Yeah.
You won't know the day or the hour. Be ready. If he gave us a timeline, it probably wouldn't be helpful.
Well, you said something earlier about like the idea of what time your parents are going to come home, and so you try to do all of the stuff in like the 10 minutes before they clean up the place, and that would be horrible for the mission.
That would not be good.
That would not be
Not be good.
thing. Yeah. All right, and then the last the one is post-millennial.
Postmillennialism was very it's going to sound strange when we say it, I think, but it was a very popular view up until World War I. Up until the 20th century, basically. World War I, Depression, World War II, the bomb, Cold War.
Yeah,
Vietnam,
it's a tough century.
Tough century. And that was that the church continues to make the world better, the world improves. And of course, this is 18th, 19th century when universities and hospitals and advancements and less poverty, and it seemed like
it was getting better.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And the modern missionary movement was
movement,
bringing schools and
haystack
hospitals.
movement, yeah.
So in other words, contra now, there was a lot more optimism about the world will become this better place, and then we will basically usher in this reign once the world is, so that's post-millennialism, and then so that we're bringing the millennium, we're sort of the church works so that Christ can return, sort of a thing. And there obviously are people who believe that now.
Yeah, I had a professor in seminary who he held it. He was actually on the committee for the ESV Study Bible, and they're in a room talking about the different articles they're going to include in it, and they're like, okay, well, let's talk about amillennialism and premillennialism. Is there a reason to talk about any others? And he goes, there is one more. And they're like, well, no one's post-millennial. He's like, I am. And then they're like, well, why? Because I believe the Bible.
Yeah.
That was kind of his response, which is actually kind of a good response in that it's this reminder, this grounding place that we can have all these discussions and debates and arguments on like, okay, well, which one is it?
Yeah, right.
When the most important thing to recognize is Christ is going to return. And so I want to, dive into this passage, Matthew 24, verses 3 through 8. Then I've got a few other questions, and then we'll go from there. But Matthew 24, verse 3, so this is before Jesus' death, resurrection, ascension. He's with his disciples. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are but the beginning of the birth pains." So what stands out here to you, Terry?
Well, I think one of the things is just that the disciples are asking this question about his return. That this is not something odd or different. It's not something new to us, that there's some sense that they were looking at what's the end of the world, that the end is going to come. What's that going to be? Give us some signs. How's that going to happen?
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming they believe that was going to happen sooner as opposed to later, which I think Jesus then tells these parables at the end to say, hey, you got to wait.
Yeah.
But that they were interested in it, even though they had Jesus there for 3.5 years. This is a couple of days before he's crucified. Really, like right at the end, they're like, hey, tell us what's going to happen. Yeah,
it seems like every generation of Christian thinks that the end times that they're living in the last days, that the end times are going to come. And even Paul, right, in some of his writings, you see a developmental of thought, like the difference between First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians, for instance. There was something happening there, and I think the disciples are cognizant of that too, because they don't just ask about, a lot of times their questions were your political kingdom, like when are
Right,
you going,
right.
when is Rome going to be overthrown, when are you going to rise up, when are we going to lead this charge so that your earthly kingdom is here. But yet in their questions here, they are asking about the end of the age. So there is this kind of awareness. They're asking about something that is bigger than just their moment.
Yeah, and I think the early church, Paul and Thessalonica, they're sharing, they're saying Jesus is coming back. It's probably one of their motivators for sharing Jesus. And then when it's not as quick and some people are dying and not being taken up, they're like, wait a minute, is this true? And that's where Paul's like, no, you got to wait. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, but maybe not in our timeline.
And that's where we get the clearest teaching on the rapture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
Yeah. In Thessalonians.
Thessalonians.
So what, in this passage, and then it kind of a few verses later, he's kind of quoting from Daniel. They're talking about Daniel. Like, what would a Jewish, what would his disciples, what would a Jewish man in the first century, like, what would they be thinking about when they're asking the question, the end of the age?
Well, we're assuming that they knew, there's one thing we don't know of all the disciples. The assumption would be they had some education. Basically, the education was in the Old Testament, learning to read, memorizing parts of it. So some of them may potentially have had Daniel memorized. But I'm assuming they don't maybe know what the timeline is for Daniel, but notice, okay, who's going to come and be seated on the throne? When is the Messiah coming? What is that going to be? So they're hopeful that someone's going to come. I think they are still believing that's going to be a physical kingdom here on earth, and Jesus is starting a spiritual kingdom before that happens.
Yeah, so what do we do with this? Obviously we could talk for another 20 minutes, another 2 hours, right, about the end of the world, but our part, right? Like, I guess it's the important thing for us. Like, I guess, what's our encouragement now as we wait for Christ's return?
Well, I think as we say, expect the unexpected. That the second coming is expected. We expect it, but whenever it happens, it's unexpected. As we talk in our teaching team, how someone can be sick or someone can get cancer, and we expect that could happen, and we expect death because we're all going to die. But when we're actually sick or when death's near, it's so unexpected, and to be ready for that somehow, to live in the tension of the now and the not yet.
Yeah, Mike, what about you? What encouragements?
Well, I do think that one of the things that we get in this chapter 24, and that's echoed or illustrated in chapter 25 with the parables, is that we won't know. I mean, Jesus is pretty clear about, the angels of heaven don't know. Even the Son of Man doesn't know, as he's speaking to them.
And maybe he does now.
Maybe he does now. But basically, be ready, be about the work of the kingdom. He talks about, just like if a master leaves his house and leaves the servants in charge, the servant can handle it one or two ways. They can be about the work of the household and be a faithful servant, be a faithful steward, or they can just start acting like the owner and then just be surprised when the owner gets back. And I think that's the message is, whether I live, 30, 40 more years and die, or whether Christ comes 10 years from now or 10 months from now, my job's the same.
Yeah.
Right? We got to be about the work of the kingdom together.
Yeah.
And, all this tells me he's got it handled.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about it. He's got it handled. Be about the work of the kingdom. And let the master worry about when the master returns.
Yeah, and I think it does. I mean, it should create a sense of urgency for us, right? This idea that we don't know when he's going to come back should create a sense of urgency. The fact that he is going to come back, it matters. The work that we have to do, it matters. I do think it's interesting how we oftentimes, and I think there's something to be said about, culturally, it's really easy to, lift up other idols, right? Idols of comfort, idols of someone else has it. Like, I've got to get my stuff together. Like, and yet we're still called, right? We're called to live with a sense of urgency. We're called to do missional work right now.
And I think that was the sense of missional urgency of what we do matters, what we share matters, what people do matter. And maybe Jesus isn't going to come tomorrow, but tomorrow isn't guaranteed to any of us. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all know people who suddenly were taken
Yeah.
or given a short period of time to live. And the missional urgency of are we doing what we need to just share Jesus, live the gospel, invite people in? And that's what why Love Where You Live, which
Yeah.
is what we're doing next. It really matters. How we live in our neighborhood matters. This is what Jesus is saying here in the second parable. I mean, that's Matthew 24 is kind of a bit of the time and the theology of what's going to happen, but the rest of his sermon is really those two stories of here's how you live in that's what's really important.
Yeah.
And waiting and be patient and looking, watching for the bridegroom, but also stewarding what God has given us well.
Yeah.
And so how we live in our neighborhood, it matters.
Yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, let's tease that a little bit. So this is the last week of Knowing Jesus. We're going to be starting a new series called Love Where You Live. We're going to continue the deep dive, with that. So there's different passages we've identified for each of the weeks. It's more of a topical series, but there are passages that we've connected to each week. So we will be doing a deep dive on those passages as the series goes. But yeah, Terry, where are we heading with that?
Yeah, I think that Paul writes in Acts. I think God calls Abraham to a certain place. God calls us to live where we live matters, and it's God appointed. We may think, well, we bought the cheapest house or the nice house in the neighborhood, but God knows our zip code and has placed us there for a purpose. And are we, how are we going to let other people in our neighborhood know about Jesus? And how do we live like Jesus? Do we know our neighbors? I think this is a perfect time with the opening up kind of our country at post-pandemic can we really be Jesus in our neighborhood? And I think we've learned one thing in the last year, that the church is more than what happens inside these walls.
For sure.
That we are the church, and how much better prepared we probably would have been a year ago had we really been incarnational much more in our neighborhood. So Jesus gives 2 commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, might. Like love him, that's so important, and then love your neighbor as yourself. So those two go hand in hand, and we're going to talk about how just to do that well, how to love where we live well.
Awesome. Well, I've really enjoyed these deep dives going through the life of Christ. You can find this conversation more on our website, calvary.church/knowingjesus. We have them on our YouTube channel. We'll be continuing to put these deep dives on our YouTube channel starting again next week. So thanks for joining us. I hope that you have a great week. We'll connect with you again next week.
God bless.